Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Raven's Readings. I'm reading from the Inimitable Jeeves, a collection of short stories written by P.G. Wodehouse in 1923. In them, Jeeves, a valet, and his employer, Bertie Wooster, are all characters in dozens of little vignettes. The stories are all told from the point of view of Bertie. I do readings twice a week, Tuesdays and Fridays. If you subscribe to my Substack newsletter, you'll get notified of my updates as soon as they're ready. If you enjoyed this reading or have other classics you'd like to hear, leave me a comment. This is part 2 of the Metropolitan Touch. Bingo is in love again and hopes to impress the girl by putting on a musical revue in the little village of Twing. He will likely overstep the mark yet again. For the next 3 weeks, I didn't see Bingo. He became a sort of voice heard off stage, developing a habit of ringing me up on long distance and consulting me on various points arising at rehearsal, until the day when he got me out of bed at 8 in the morning to ask whether I thought Merry Christmas was a good title. I told him then that this nuisance must now cease, and after that he cheesed it, and practically passed out of my life, until one afternoon when I got back to the flat to dress for dinner, found Jeeves inspecting a whacking big poster sort of thing which he had draped over the back of an armchair. "Good Lord, Jeeves," I said. I was feeling rather weak that day, and the thing shook me. "What on earth's that?" "Mr. Little sent it to me, sir, and desired me to bring it to your notice." "Well, you've certainly done it." I took another look at the object. There was no doubt about it. He caught the eye. It was about 7 feet long, and most of the lettering in about as bright red ink as I ever struck. This is how it ran. Twing Village Hall, Friday, December 23rd. Richard Little presents a new and original revue entitled What Ho, Twing? Book by Richard Little, lyrics by Richard Little, music by Richard Little. With the full Twing Juvenile Company and Chorus. Scenic effects by Richard Little, produced by Richard Little. "What do you make of it, Jeeves?" I said. "I confess I am a little doubtful, sir. I think Mr. Little would have been done better to follow my advice and confine himself to good works about the village. You think the thing will be a frost?" "I could not hazard a conjecture, sir, but my experience has been that what pleases the London public is not always so acceptable to the rural mind. The Metropolitan Touch sometimes proves a trifle too exotic for the provinces." "I suppose I ought to go down and see the dash thing." "I think Mr. Little would be wounded were you not present, sir." The village hall in Twing is a smallest building, smelling of apples. It was full when I turned up on the evening of the 23rd, for I had purposely timed myself to arrive not long before the kickoff. I have had experience of one or two of these binges and didn't want to run any risk of coming early and finding myself shoved into a seat in one of the front rows where I wouldn't be able to execute a quiet sneak into the open air halfway through the proceedings, if the occasion seemed to demand it. I secured a nice strategic position near the door at the back of the hall. From where I stood, I had a good view of the audience. As always on these occasions, the first few rows were occupied by the nibs, and consisting of the squire, a fairly mauve old sportsman with white whiskers, and his family, a platoon of local parsons, and perhaps a couple of dozen of prominent pew holders. Then came a dense squash of what you might call the lower middle classes, and at the back, where I was, we came down with a jerk in the social scale, this end of the hall being given up almost entirely to a collection of frankly tough eggs, who had rolled up not so much for any love of the drama as because there was a free tea after the show. Take it for all in all, a representative gathering of Twing life and thought. The nibs were whispering in a pleased manner to each other, the lower middles were sitting up very straight, as if they'd been bleached, and the tough eggs whiled away the time by cracking nuts and exchanging low rustic wheezes. Bingo's girl, Mary Burgess, was at the piano playing a waltz. Beside her stood the curate, Wingham, apparently recovered now. The temperature in there, I should think, was about 127. Somebody jabbed me heartily in the lower ribs, and I perceived the man Steggles. "Hello," he said. "I didn't know you were coming down." I didn't like the chap, but we Woosters can wear the mask. I beamed a bit. Oh, yes, I said. Bingo wanted me to roll up and see his show. I hear he's giving us something pretty ambitious, said the man Steggles. Big FX and all that sort of thing. I believe so. Of course, it means a lot to him, doesn't it? He's told you about the girl, of course? Yes, and I hear you're laying 7-1 against him, I said, eyeing the blighter a trifle austerely. He didn't quiver. Just a little flutter to relieve the monotony of country life, he said. But you've got the facts a bit wrong. It's down in the village that they're laying 7-1. I can do you better than that. If you feel in a speculative mood, how about a tenner at 100-8? Good Lord, are you giving that? Yes, somehow, said Steggles meditatively. I have a sort of feeling, a kind of premonition that something's going to go wrong tonight. You know what Little is, a bungler, if there ever was one. Something tells me that this show of his is going to be a frost. And if it is, of course, I should think it would prejudice the girl against him pretty badly. His standing always was rather shaky. Are you going to try and smash up the show? I said sternly. Me? Said Steggles. Why, what could I do? Half a minute, I want to go and speak to somebody. He buzzed off, leaving me distinctly disturbed. I could see from the fellow's eye that he was meditating some of his customary rough stuff, and I thought Bingo ought to be warned. But there wasn't time, and I couldn't get at him. Almost immediately after Steggles had left me, the curtain went up. Except as a prompter, Bingo wasn't much in evidence in the early part of the performance. The thing at the outset was merely one of those weird dramas which you dig out of books published around Christmas time and entitled 12 Little Plays for the Tots or something like that. The kids drooled on in the usual manner, the booming voice of Bingo ringing out from time to time behind the scenes when the fatheads forgot their lines, and the audience was settling down into the sort of torpor usual on these occasions when the first of Bingo's interpolated bits occurred. It was that number which what's-her-name sings in that revue at the Palace. You would recognize the tune if I hummed it, but I can never get hold of the dash thing. It always got 3 encores at the Palace, and it went well now, even with a squeaky-voiced child jumping on and off the key, like a chamois of the Alps leaping from crag to crag. Even the tough eggs liked it. At the end of the second refrain, the entire house was shouting for an encore, and the kid with the voice like a slate pencil took a deep breath and started to let it go once more. At this point, all the lights went out. I don't know when I've had anything so sudden and devastating happen to me before. They didn't flicker, they just went out. The hall was in complete darkness. Well, of course, that sort of broke the spell, as you might put it. People started to sound directions, and the tough eggs stamped their feet and settled down for a pleasant time. And of course, young Bingo had to make an ass of himself. His voice suddenly shot at us out of the darkness. Ladies and gentlemen, something has gone wrong with the lights. Well, the tough eggs were tickled by this bit of information straight from the stable. They took it up as sort of a battle cry. Then, after about 5 minutes, the lights went up again, and the show resumed. It took 10 minutes after that to get the audience back into its state of coma, but eventually it began to settle down, and everything was going nicely when a small boy with a face like a turbot edged out in front of the curtain, which had been lowered after a pretty painful scene about a wishing ring or a fairy's curse or something of that sort. And he started to sing that song of George Thingummies out of Cuddle Up. You know what I mean. Always Listen to Mother, Girls, it's called, and he gets the audience to join in and sing the refrain. Quite a ripish ballad, and one which I myself have frequently sung in my bath with not a little vim, but by no means the sort of thing for a children's Christmas entertainment in the old village hall. Right from the start of the first refrain, the bulk of the audience had begun to stiffen in their seats and fan themselves, and the Burgess girl at the piano was accompanying in a stunned, mechanical sort of way, while the curate at her side averted his gaze in a pained manner. The tough eggs, however, were all for it. At the end of the second refrain, the kids stopped again and began to sidle towards the wings, upon which the following brief duologue took place. Young Bingo, a voice heard off, ringing against the rafters. Go on. The kid, coyly, I don't like to. Young Bingo, still louder. Go on, you little biter, or I'll slay you. Well, I suppose the kid thought it over swiftly and realized that Bingo, being in a position to get at him, had better be conciliated, whatever the harvest might be, for he shuffled down to the front and, having shut his eyes and giggled hysterically, said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I will now call upon Squire Tressiter to oblige us by singing the refrain." You know, with the most charitable feelings towards him, there are moments when you can't help thinking that young Bingo ought to be in some sort of a home. I suppose, poor fish, he had pictured this as the big punch of the evening. He'd imagined, I take it, the squire would spring jovially to his feet, rip the song off his chest, and all would be gaiety and mirth. Well, what happened was simply that old Tressiter, and mark you, I'm not blaming him, just sat where he was, swelling and turning a brighter purple every second. The lower middle classes remained in frozen silence, waiting for the roof to fall. The only section of the audience that really seemed to enjoy the idea was the tough eggs, who yelled with enthusiasm. It was jam for the tough eggs. And then the lights went out again. When they went up, some minutes later, they disclosed the squire marching stiffly out at the head of his family, fed up to the eyebrows. The Burgess girl at the piano with a pale, set look, and the curate gazing at her with something in his expression that seemed to suggest that, although all this was no doubt deplorable, he had spotted the silver lining. The show went on once more. There were great chunks of plays for the Tots dialogue, and then the girl at the piano struck up the prelude to that Orange Girl number that's the big hit at the Palace Revue. I took it that this was to be Bingo's smashing one-act finale. The entire company was on the stage, and a clutching hand had appeared round the edge of the curtain, ready to pull at the right moment. It looked like the finale, all right. It wasn't long before I realized that there was something more. It was the finish. I take it you know that orange number at the Palace? He goes, "Oh, won't you something oranges, my something oranges, my something oranges. Oh, won't you something, I forget, something, tumbity yet," you know, or words to that effect. It's a dashed clever lyric, and the tune's good too, but the thing that made the number was the business where the girls take oranges out of their baskets, and toss them lightly to the audience. I don't know if you've ever noticed it, but I always seem to tickle an audience to bits when they get things thrown to them from the stage. Every time I've been to the Palace, the customers have simply gone wild over this number. But at the Palace, of course, the oranges are made of yellow wool. And the girls don't so much as chuck them as drop them limply into the first and second rows. I began to gather that the business was going to be treated rather differently tonight when a dashed great chunk of pips and mildew sailed past my ear and burst on the wall behind me. Another lined up with a squelch on the neck of one of the nibs in the third row, and then a third took me right on the tip of the nose, and I kind of lost interest in the proceedings for a while. When I had scrubbed my face and got my eye to stop watering for a moment, I saw that the evening's entertainment had begun to resemble one of Belfast's livelier nights. The air was thick with shrieks and fruit. The kids on the stage, with Bingo buzzing distractedly to and fro in their midst, were having the time of their lives. I suppose they realized that this couldn't go on forever and were making the most of their chances. The tough eggs had begun to pick up all the oranges that hadn't burst and were shooting them back, so the audience got it both coming and going. In fact, take it all around, there was a certain amount of confusion, and just as things had really began to hot up, out went the lights again. It seemed to be about my time for leaving, so I slid for the door. I was hardly outside when the audience began to stream out. They surged about me in twos and threes, and I've never seen a public body so dashed unanimous on any point. To a man and to a woman, they were cursing poor old Bingo. There was a large and rapidly growing school of thought which held that the best thing to do would be to waylay him as he emerged and splash him about in the village pond a bit. There was such a dickens of a lot of these enthusiasts, and they looked so jolly determined that it seemed to me the only matey thing to do was to go behind and warn young Bingo to turn his coat collar up and breeze off snakily by some side exit. I went behind and found him sitting on a box in the wings, perspiring pretty freely and looking more or less like the spot marked with a cross where the accident happened. His hair was standing up and his ears were hanging down, and one harsh word would undoubtedly have made him burst into tears. "Bertie," he said hollowly as he saw me, "it was that blighter Steggles. I caught one of the kids before he could get away and got it all out of him. Steggles substituted real oranges for the balls of Will, which with an infinite sweat and at cost of nearly a quid I especially prepared. Well, I will now proceed to tear him limb from limb. It'll be something to do." I hated to spoil his daydreams, but it had to be. "Good heavens, man," I said. "You haven't time for frivolous amusements now. You've got to get out, and quick." "Bertie," said Bingo in a dull voice, "she was here just now. She said it was all my fault and that she would never speak to me again. She says she had always suspected me of being a heartless practical joker. Now she knew. She said, oh, well, she ticked me off properly." "That's the least of your troubles," I said. It seemed impossible to rouse the poor Zib to a sense of his position. "Do you realize that about 200 of Twing's heftiest are waiting for you outside to chuck you into the pond?" "No." "Absolutely." For a moment, the poor chap seemed crushed, but only for a moment. There has always been something of the good old English bulldog breed about Bingo. A strange, sweet smile flickered for an instant over his face. "It's all right," he said. "I can sneak out through the cellar and climb over the wall at the back. They can't intimidate me." It couldn't have been more than a week later when Jeeves, after he had brought me my tea, gently steered me away from the sporting page of the Morning Post and directed my attention to an announcement in the engagements and marriages column. It was a brief statement that a marriage had been arranged and would shortly take place between the Honourable and Reverend Hubert Wingham, third son of the Right Honourable the Earl of Sturridge, and Mary, only daughter of the late Matthew Burgess of Wetherly Court, hence. "Of course," I said, after giving it to the East-West. "I expected this, Jeeves." "Yes, sir." "She would never have forgiven him for what happened that night." "No, sir." "Well," I said, as I took a sip of the fragrant and the steaming, "I don't suppose it will take old Bingo long to get over it. It's about the 111th time this sort of thing has happened to him. You're the man I'm sorry for." "Me, sir?" "Well, dash it all, you can't have forgotten what a deuce of a lot of trouble you took to bring the thing off for Bingo. It's too bad that all your work should have been wasted." "Not entirely wasted, sir." "Eh?" "It is true that my efforts to bring about the match between Mr. Little and the young lady were not successful, but still I look back upon the matter with a certain satisfaction." "Because you did your best, you mean?" "Not entirely, sir. Though, of course, that thought also gives me pleasure. I was alluding more particularly to the fact that I had found the affair financially remunerative." "Financially remunerative? What do you mean?" "When I learned that Mr. Steggles had interested himself in the contest, sir, I went shares with my friend Brookfield and bought the book which had been made on the issue by the Cow and Horses. It has proved a highly profitable investment." "Your breakfast will be ready almost immediately, sir. Kidneys on toast and mushrooms. I will bring it in to you when you ring." End of chapter. Well, that was definitely the most entertaining review ever to hit Twing. Bingo will move on. Bertie has his quiet life back, and Jeeves has a bit of extra money. Stay tuned for the next episode in this series, Chapter 16, The Delayed Exit of Claude and Eustace. The cousins are back, and along with Aunt Agatha. If you subscribe to my newsletter, you'll get notified of my updates as soon as they're ready. If you enjoy this reading or have other classics you'd like to hear, leave me a comment. Check out my other posts on my Substack at ravensview.substack.com. And remember to share this with your friends. Ta-ta for now.